news. Tickets for the Conference on Religious Trauma, Court 2023, are now available. Also, if you're interested in an ad-free version of the Divorcing Religion podcast, come join me over on Patreon. Links for both are in the show notes. Thanks. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Divorcing Religion podcast. I'm your host, Janice Selby. I'm a registered professional counselor and a religious recovery consultant. I'm so pleased today to have Dr. Ling Lam join me as my guest. Dr. Ling is a lecturer in the counseling psychology department at Santa Clara University, where he teaches courses on complex trauma, crisis intervention, LGBT counseling, family therapy, couple therapy, and multicultural psychotherapy. I reached out to Ling after reading his article called Updating the Software in Psychology Today magazine. In that article, Ling notes that a lack of parental attunement, being rejected by schoolmates, and the growing awareness that he was gay led to episodes of dissociation, and struggling with thoughts of suicide drove him to a fervent, conservative, and homophobic Christian church. Earning 2 engineering degrees brought Ling a measure of external success, but he still suffered from inner chaos and depression. Enrolling in a graduate counseling program launched him onto his inner journey. With a profound understanding of the human need for safe connection, Ling is now also a licensed marriage and family therapist with a part-time practice in Palo Alto and San Francisco. Welcome, Ling.
I'm glad to be here, Jen.
I'm so glad to have you here. I know as soon as I read that article, I turned to my husband and said, I must see if this person would be willing to engage with me. And now you've agreed to speak at the Conference on Religious Trauma as well. And I'm so grateful to you, and also just for spending this time with me today to talk a little bit about your own experience.
Well, thank you for inviting me and having this conversation with me. This is something that I think is very personal in my own life, my own journey with my sexuality, with religion, with spirituality. I'm really looking forward in having that conversation with you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Our guests might not know that your background was in China and then British Hong Kong, and then you moved to the United States. What was it like doing such tremendous moves? I mean, there's so many different cultures involved there.
Yeah, it is. It is, I think, a very formative part of my growing up experience is the moving to different countries, different cultures that speak different language, dialect. And because I think, when I study our brain and our psychological development, our brain is wired for connection and belonging. And I think looking back, that is one of the things that I lack. A sense of being accepted for who I am in the family of origin. When my family first moved to Hong Kong at that time, people in Hong Kong were quite discriminatory against people who are from mainland China. So I remember just experiencing a lot of bullying early on in school. That again really interfered with my sense of belonging and acceptance in Hong Kong, at least in the early years. But then very quickly, I figured out a survival strategy. I think we all need to figure out a survival strategy when we are living in whatever environment that we grew up in that are not meeting our needs. So my survival strategy when I was bullied and being rejected in the schools in Hong Kong in the early years is to study very hard, to get very good grade as a way to earn a sense of worthiness. And so after high school, I finished high school in Hong Kong. And then after high school, I came to the US. It's another experience of feeling uprooted, feeling a sense of belonging, starting from scratch. And that's also when I started exploring my sexuality for the first time in my life. So, but basically, I think the moving around, really struggling with a sense of belonging, I think that really maybe prime some of my earliest psychological experiences and relational template.
Wow. And so did your parents come with you when you moved to the United States?
No, so I came here by myself. At that time, in the early 90s, I think Hong Kong was at that time a British colony, but there's a pending handover back to mainland China. So it's actually very common for high school students, if they are able to study abroad. So I came to the US by myself. Actually, I have never even visited the US before I came here. My first day ever in the US is freshman orientation for international students, which I must tell you is very disorienting. Because up till then, my impression and knowledge of the US, everything I gained from 90210, which is very different from what I actually experienced. So it's quite a cultural shock. In addition to, just being here by myself, it's the first time living away from my family, a new culture, a new language. So everything is new.
Wow. Yes. And so just going back a little bit to the childhood, and in your article you spoke of discovering maybe there was some parental misattunement or a lack of attunement. Can you talk a little bit about that? Would people find that in some instances that may be cultural, or is it specific to each family of origin? Our listeners might like to know a little bit about parental attunement.
Yeah. So I think in my own experience, I think the lack of sufficient attunement from my parents, first of all, I want to say that I have gone through such a journey with my parents. And now my parents are in their 80s and they still live in Hong Kong. And I actually just visited them Christmas 2022 for the first time in 3 years.
Wow.
Because of the pandemic. So I want to say I'm in a good place with them emotionally. I see them that they are limited by their own trauma in their life that interfere with their capacity to be there in the way that I needed them to emotionally. So I just want to say in my heart, I think I went through a phase where I was very angry and disappointed in them. But I think right now I just want to spend whatever time that I can with them in the time that we have left together. So, but I think there are many aspects to the lack of attunement in my growing up experience. Part of that is cultural. My dad is this very, in some way, traditional Chinese man who just not connected with his emotion, let alone expressing his emotion, just never say, I love you. I know he loves me, doesn't know how to express it. We don't have much to talk about. I think a lot of that is just a cultural narrative about what it's like to be a man, which is to not show your emotion and not feel your emotions. And my mom has a lot of her own trauma. My mom was born in Indonesia, and I think she's Indonesian Chinese. And then she was born really during the Japanese War in World War II, where some of her earliest memory is bombing and needing to sort of really, go into shelter to survive. And then her family moved back to China, the Cultural Revolution, they lost everything. So she has a lot of upheaval in her life that now I understand get in the way of her being regulated emotionally. That then also get in the way of her being there to help me feel attuned to and wire my brain in terms of secure attachment. So looking back, it's really a cascading effect of generational trauma, cultural dominant narrative, and just, what I keep coming back to is hurt people sometimes inadvertently hurt other people because of how the trauma that we hold in our body get in the way of us being there.
Yeah, very true.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you so much. That's so thoughtful and very compassionate. And I think that's important for us when we are looking also at the topic of religious trauma and religious trauma syndrome, because you came to religion in your adulthood, but for those of us who grew up in it and were indoctrinated in it from our birth and didn't have a say-so, we can also really struggle with anger towards our parents and, feeling that we missed out on so much that was maybe normal for people around us who weren't in such fundamentalist homes. So I really appreciate how you've considered this. You've moved through some of these feelings yourself related to your own parents, and you've landed on the side of compassion and understanding that your folks have had their own trauma that they've had to live through and try to integrate into their own life. And then as they were parents to you, they maybe did the best they could, but there were some shortcomings, as with all parenting.
That's right. And I do want to say that in my own journey, that I think I went through a long period where I really wrestled with a sense of anger and feeling disappointed in them. And I think for a long time, we had a very tricky sort of a relationship. So I just want to validate for any people listening or watching this, that I think is so important to give yourself the space and time to grieve the lost years, to grieve how, the metaphor that comes up is sometimes we live in society or churches or organizations where there are dominant narratives that are quite toxic to our soul. And sometimes when we swim in stinky water long enough, we begin to absorb some of that. And even though we are on the other side of that, I think there's a lot of grief and loss that is really important to create space for. And part of grieving is to really create space for the anger at the authority figures that we perceive failed us, anger at the indoctrination, the dominant narratives that poison our soul and create so much suffering. It's really important not to do any spiritual bypassing, to really give the time and space for all those difficult emotions, honor them, be present with them, listen to them, and listen to the wisdom and messages that those emotions have for our ongoing healing journey.
Wow, yes. Grief work is so much a part of the work that I do with my own clients in their recovery from religious trauma syndrome. They have often lost their identity. They've lost their community. They've lost their purpose that they had perceived, and their entire worldview has dissolved around them. And that is, we can't mourn what we don't acknowledge. And those are multiple significant losses. And I think, too, potentially for people who move to completely different cultures, such as you did, leaving China to go to British Hong Kong, and then again coming to the United States, there's additional losses around that. And that even has similarities with leaving fundamentalist religion and entering secular society. And we can kind of feel like spiritual refugees is a term that I have used sometimes, where we don't feel like we have a home anymore. What we knew, the familiar things are gone. And that also takes time for us to find our feet and to kind of find a secure landing place again.
That's why I love the word spiritual refugee that you use. In some way, there is sort of many layers of losses, like you said, loss of meaning, loss of community, loss of belonging, loss of identity, loss of a worldview that sometimes some people may have used for since the beginning of their life. And almost like there's a sense of being exiled, but in some way almost choosing to be exiled in order to reconnect with the authentic part of ourselves. But that exile journey can be so alone, can be so destabilizing and confusing.
Yes. And so were there any support groups or groups that you met with of other students who had left Hong Kong or other places and had landed in the United States and were trying to figure out where they fit in? Did you have support that way?
Yeah, this is the sad thing is because, British colonial Hong Kong is a very interesting society. Even though 99% of the population are ethnic Chinese, it's the white percent British are in charge and in power. So looking back, I think unconsciously I have absorbed a lot of internalized racism. Growing up, really see my own identity as an Asian person as inferior. So very sad when I look back at when I first came to the US. I was determined not to hang out with students from Hong Kong and China, which is really such a classic expression of internalized homophobia. I was intent to being part of the dominant group and try very hard to almost fit myself into the white heteronormative Christian culture, because that is sadly at that time in my mind, that's how I was hoping I would find a sense of belonging and acceptance. So, but of course, it just deprived myself of even that community of people that I share common experiences with. And that really is the first couple of years of my life. It's really the manifestation of all this internalized racism that I have. Of course, at one point I became a Christian in a very conservative, sort of a homophobic church, right? Then I have internalized homophobia then as a result also. So I have a lot of internalized stuff.
Yeah.
But I think I have squeezed a lot of the dirty water from that sponge over the years. So I think my sponge is half dry now from the
Beautiful.
dirty water that I have to absorb along the way. Yeah.
Oh, I really like that. Looking at sexuality and your sexual journey of really embracing and becoming who you are and comfortable with who you are. And we have many LGBTQ listeners to the podcast, and also people who are, because they often, many of us married quite young because we were very religious. And the only reason that we married our partner was because they also were religious. It wasn't anything about having anything else in common or being attracted, or we just were told we were never to have sex outside of marriage. And of course, it had to be heterosexual sex. And so we were kind of pushed into marrying at that point. And now a lot of folks come to me, they're maybe in their 30s, 40s, 50s, and they no longer subscribe to the religious beliefs that they had. And they are also questioning, well, am I even straight, or do I endorse monogamy? Or, were these just things that were forced onto me that I was told had to be the way my life is? And so they're really unwrapping multiple layers there, trying to figure out who they are and get to their core self and be able to live authentically. Many people just aren't sure. They've been told their whole life who they are and who they have to be. And it can be scary and daunting to try and figure that out for ourselves.
Definitely. Well, even though I didn't grow up in a sort of religious environment, my parents are very agnostic. But when I became a Christian in that very conservative church, when I was in college, I think afterwards, when I left the church or in that very conservative fundamentalist environment, I had to go through my own version of what you are describing. I imagine not to the extent of somebody who has had to be in that environment since childhood. But I remember still it was very challenging to almost reconstruct everything from scratch when you still have to live life every day. It's almost like trying to change the tire when you still have to drive the car, because you cannot just stop life while you rewrite your source code in the software.
Exactly. What a great word picture that is. And Yes, I do find that there are additional types of grief that we go through when we are examining certain aspects of our life. If the culture at large isn't familiar with those things, then we don't really get adequate support. So if we have changed our belief system, say we're no longer Christian or believe in God, the response is often, well, so what? Big deal. You stopped believing in Santa Claus. But that is so invalidating and really doesn't come close to touching the depth of the love and the relationship that we felt that we had towards this God that we believed in. It's just profound loss that people struggle with. And when it's not understood or met with understanding, it can make things even harder.
That's right. Part of what I'm hearing is almost like for people who come out of that kind of religious environment, right? They already feel exiled from what they are familiar with, almost their quote unquote home country. They were exiled from their home country. Yeah. But their new country also don't quite understand them and see them with this kind of eyes that make them feel not heard or their pain and what they are going through minimized. Right. So it's almost like just an impossible dilemma, walking out of a hot stove into a frying pan, so to speak. Yeah.
Exactly. So when you, were you already recognizing your sexuality and before you adopted the religious beliefs?
So I was a very late bloomer. So I didn't even start thinking about my sexuality until I was like sophomore year in college. And when I first started wrestling with my sexuality, I just find myself going into a very dark depression state because I was also very cut off from my emotions growing up. I think I have a lot of trauma that my body is carrying that I have no awareness of and no language to speak of. But I think as I begin to look at my sexuality and this a lot of other reasons, I fell into this deep depression. One thing led to another. I became a Christian my junior year and joined this very conservative church. So they are happening like roughly around the same time. And so before I really solidified my understanding of who I am in terms of my sexuality, I got involved with the church and I put my sexuality aside. Right. And actually, on the recommendation of some friends at this church, I become involved with some ex-gay ministry for a few years. And so that's, I think, when I really, really have a lot of struggle internally about sort of this dilemma of feeling like there's a part of who I am that's not quite, people at church, they are very nice on the outside, right? We love you, we love everybody. But I still remember that I shared with a pastor once that I was gay from the perspective of, I want to be ex-gay, I'm still going to ex-gay ministry, I'm not going to live the lifestyle or whatever it is, right? But you know what the pastor said? After I came out to him, I was volunteering in Sunday school at that time. So he said, I don't judge you. Thank you for sharing with me. But you know that I couldn't let you continue volunteering in Sunday school, right?
Oh, dear.
It's not that I have a problem with it, but if the parents find out, I don't know how to explain to them. So this is a person in power, really shirking their responsibility, right? Almost like, I'm okay with it, but you cannot be in Sunday school. So things like that in retrospect, is really so traumatizing and so confusing to me. On the one hand, because of my childhood history of lacking a sense of belonging, there's a part of me that's long for that sense of belonging and community that I see in the church. But at the same time, if they know who I am, then that belonging is like an illusion that's kind of dissipate, right? So it's quite a confusing time. But long story short, I started exploring my sexuality. I became a Christian, got involved with ex-gay ministry, pushed my sexuality way down into the shadow. And then at some point, finally couldn't sort of hold a contradiction anymore, internal contradiction, sort of needing to leave sort of church for a while, explore my sexuality, sort of coming back to church for a while, and then sort of try to explore my own path in terms of my spirituality. So you were asking me before we started recording, where are you right now in terms of your religious identity? And my answer is, I don't know. It's different every day. It's kind of like my spiritual journey. I still see myself as spiritual, but I see myself almost like the spiritual journey is like I'm sitting in a kayak and I'm going downstream, and the river is taking me to wherever I need to go. I don't know what will happen tomorrow, except sort of having gone down the river for a number of years, I just have this more and more trust that if I just sit in the kayak and be in the present moment and pay attention to how my body feels, pay attention to my experience, that the river will take me to wherever I need to go in terms of whatever is my spiritual destination. But it's hard to put
beautiful.
in words. Yes, in this moment, sort of a label. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that. That sounds beautifully supportive and non-judgmental of yourself. You're not insisting that you be at a certain destination. Yeah, I really appreciate that. And I know that it will have some listeners and viewers who can very much relate to that as well. Did you, or how did your folks respond? Did you tell them you were a Christian, that you had embraced Christianity at any point? Did you talk with your parents about that?
Yeah, so yes. So first, I told my parents that I became a Christian, and my mom cried because she, because of her own sort of perception, just thought becoming a Christian is joining a cult. Right. So she really cried because she's afraid that she will lose me. Right. But a few years later, after she became okay with me being a Christian, I told her I was gay. So she cried. And she's like, oh my God. And then she said, wait, wasn't you a Christian? Why don't you go to church? Maybe that can fix you being gay. So it's just because she's from a generation that she didn't quite understand either. So poor mom, I think she just went through several rounds of like, getting confused, and then thought she understood and getting confused again. And I couldn't quite put the two pieces together. But I did say at one point, sort of, I was a Christian, and it was hard for them. But then ultimately they come to be okay with it. And then I share with them I was gay. They also had a hard time with it, but they also come to a place of acceptance, ultimately. Yeah.
Wow, that's a great story. Thank you very much for sharing that. I know people will find that hopeful and encouraging. It seems like we have this struggle that goes on, and I can see it, when we're a teenager emerging into adulthood, and then again when we have transitions in life. So for my clients, it's leaving religion. And then also for some folks, it's letting people know that they are not hetero and, embracing monogamy like they did in their former days. So it's like there's this tug of war internally between approval, because we are always seeking that approval, especially from our parents. But also then the other side of that is authenticity. We're desperate to be accepted, but we're desperate to be accepted as we are and known as we are. And there's this kind of tug of war. And then eventually it seems one or the other of those is going to win out. We're either going to just completely suppress who we are and just live a life pretending, or we are going to say, you know what? This is me. This is who I am. So, that's a hard one.
The way you are describing it really resonates. It reminds me almost, I think there is almost like we are asked to either feel the part of us that long for authenticity or feel the part of us that long for love and acceptance. And when we are told that we cannot have both, that really was toxic to our soul. because that's such a fundamental human longing to not just to be loved, but to be loved for who we are.
Mm-hmm.
Not just to be authentic in a community that we can find a sense of belonging. Both are important.
Yes, and it's definitely, it's a possibility that when we come out either as being gay or LGBTQIA, or come out as no longer being a believer, we do risk being rejected by the people closest to us. It can be the most terrifying thing. Sometimes it's not even just our parents, it's our partner. And that is such a huge thing to grapple with, for people to grapple with personally.
Yeah. And I think almost like this is almost like on some level is losing all the closest relationship, right? So I just want to say to any people who's listening or watching this, that I want to call out your sense of courage to take that step of faith to come out of religion.
Mm-hmm.
Because it is a step of faith, because you stand to lose so much.
Yeah, it does require courage.
That's right.
That's for sure. So you were able to find your way out of that conservative religion that you were bound to for a few years there, and instead start really embracing who you are, and moving out in that community. And then had you completed your engineering degrees at that time? Where does that factor in?
Yeah, so like I said earlier, in my childhood, when I was bullied and rejected, I just studied very hard. Mm-hmm. That is my survival strategy. So I completed my 2 engineering degree before all this drama happened.
Oh, so wow.
It's kind of like, I just like put my head down, study, right? That's my way of avoiding, right, what I really need to face, which is some of these larger questions of life, who I am, what I believe, what is meaningful to me, and how to build relationship. Yeah, so for a long time, I'm a single story of excelling academically and not a child, unfortunately. Yeah.
Oh dear. So then it was a friend who thought that you might find the a counseling program in grad school interesting.
Yeah. So I finished my 2 engineering degree, and it parallel to my sexuality, religion journey. Sort of at one point, I just had a quarter-life crisis because I worked for a company that actually invented HDMI, which is everywhere. Wow. But don't you think it takes special management talent to be the company that invented HDMI and not make too much money off it? It's amazing in terms of the management strategy that is needed to do that. But actually, the stock price is going nowhere. And I just went through this phase where I'm just like, what am I doing in my life? And at that time is summer of 2002. I went to Russia and volunteered in an orphanage during the summer. And when I came back, I just feel like it's sort of my heart is open in a way that I didn't know what to do with it. I find myself crying, a lot of my own trauma. When I work with this orphan with a lot of trauma, my own trauma is coming to the surface. I didn't know what to do with it. Then I happened to have lunch with a friend who is enrolled in the counseling psychology program at Santa Clara University. And he said, oh, you would like this. And I didn't know too much about it, but I decided to enroll because I was desperate for something different that will help me sort of find out who I am more. So I enrolled in the graduate program in counseling psychology. I realized I love it. It feels like fish in water. Then I get licensed, and now I'm teaching. And then I have my practice as a therapist.
Wow, those feel like they're at very different ends of a spectrum, with engineering and being so cerebral, and then being in a career that is so kind of emotional. Psychology, there's a lot of emotions that are involved there. How does that work for you? How do you fuse those or blend those together?
One thing that I love about being a therapist is the way that I do therapy. I can bring my full self into the therapy room. So I happen to work with a lot of engineers because of my background. So that comes in handy. I know the terms. I can talk about linear algebra. I know the software sort of release schedule. So I can talk in engineering terms. And I think that actually helped me build credibility and a sense of trust, because therapy is about joining your clients where they are. And I find my engineering background actually really helped me have the language and the awareness and the understanding to join a lot of where my clients are. And also I find there's a lot of synergy actually between engineering thinking and family systems framework that's part of therapy. When I start thinking in terms of systems therapy, I was like, oh, this is so intuitive. This is exactly how I think in terms of when I was in engineering. So part of the classes I teach is family systems class. I really teach in terms of engineering thinking in the family systems class, how the different pieces are interconnected, right? How everything is connected to everything else. How the past is connected to present. How the internal is connected to external. How the thought is connected to emotions. How relationship is connected to our sense of identity. Everything is interconnected. So that's very engineering.
Wow.
And I have to debug those chips back in the days.
Well, I never thought of engineering as beautiful, but the way that you just described that, it really, it seems beautiful. And it makes me think for some reason of Star Trek, which is a show that I love, and particularly The Next Generation. And there was Commander Data, and there was a lot of struggles and interest there on his part about emotion and becoming, how could he become more human and more emotional? Wow. You've had such a journey. It's just incredible. And it's like you've opened up like a beautiful flower, just really blossomed to experience so much of life and not be trapped in a tiny way of thinking and interpreting things.
You know, what you are saying remind me of one of the fundamental assumptions of humanistic psychology is within all of us, there's a seedling towards wholeness and healing and growth. So in some way within all of us is that seedling that's waiting to be blossomed, that naturally will blossom, if not because of things that get in the way. And I think part of a lot of overcoming religious trauma is about removing the residue on the windshield so that we can have a clean windshield, so that this seedling that's within all of us can just naturally become fully who we are in a sense.
Yes. And when we grow up in a really fundamentalist environment, we tend to think in very binary terms. So there's a lot of rigidity there. And we can leave that fundamentalist religion, but we often end up bringing that fundamentalist mindset with us. It's the filter through which we still see things. We're still thinking in very black and white terms because we're not familiar with nuance and we're not comfortable with shades of gray. So we have to be patient and give ourselves time to get there. But it's something that it helps us to be aware of, because we can really feel pulled to one side or another, pressured that we have to make a decision and a great big commitment, when I really like your idea of just floating along in the kayak and seeing where the river is taking you.
That's right. There's so many things to be curious about in life and in the world. And sometimes we are so rigidly attached to the all or nothing thinking that can be so much a legacy of those fundamentalist environment, that in some way, almost like we are in a movie Inception, we wake up from one dream only to find ourselves still trapped in the all or nothing thinking, right? To wake up from that dream.
Wow. Yeah. That's pretty accurate, I think. And I want people to have compassion for themselves and just try and be okay with the fact that it's going to take time. I wish it was as simple as just flipping a switch. Oh, I don't believe that anymore. Okay, that's fine. I'll just go in this new direction. But there's so many tentacles when it comes to indoctrination, especially childhood indoctrination and even cultural indoctrination. So it takes us a while to kind of extricate ourselves from that. And here I am, even 12 years later from when I realized that Christianity wasn't working for me. And I still sometimes have things come up for me. Maybe I'll hear a song in a TV show, maybe a hymn or something that's very Christian in origin, and it will still evoke some feelings for me. And how could it not? Because that was my whole life and identity. And I was happy in it. I really enjoyed it. I didn't ever expect to be without it or on the outside of that.
Yeah. Part of what I'm hearing is a deep acceptance of the part of you that is holding some feelings. And this part comes up when you listen to certain songs or hymns. And I so appreciate, because in some way, I really believe the path of healing is to really understand all parts belong. There are no bad parts. I mean, that's the name of a recent book. There are no bad parts. All parts belong. And for us to really accept and be curious and embrace all of the parts that we are carrying in our experiences and in our body.
Yeah, including, of course, then any coping mechanisms that we developed along the way. They were there to protect us. That's one way we survived those difficult circumstances. And so we don't have to be angry about those things or embarrassed about them. That helped us survive.
That's right.
And now maybe those coping mechanisms aren't so helpful anymore or aren't as necessary. We can't erase them and pretend that they're not part of us, because they have been for quite a while. But we can open up to seeing new ways, new methods of coping and learning and growing.
Yeah. What you just shared remind me of one of my favorite metaphors when it comes to the healing journey is when you grow up in a desert, you need to learn to survive by not needing water. Thank goodness that you figure out how to survive in that environment. But for many people, they have since left the desert and moved to Hawaii. They are still optimizing around not needing water. That is the part that needs some time to change, is to really come to the here and now. I'm in Hawaii now, and it's okay to drink water.
Beautiful.
And sometimes what saved us earlier is what constricts us, our aliveness today, because these things become unconscious and automatic.
That's so true. Yeah. Or I've said it before, the tie that binds can become the tie that strangles. And that's the same kind of idea. I really appreciate the word pictures and metaphors that you use in talking about these things. So it sounds like internal family systems and somatic work, those have been two really important elements for you.
Yes. Somatic work, internal family system, relational therapy, those are, in my professional journey, those are the things that I hold very dear to my heart.
This has just been such a delightful conversation. I'm really, really glad that you could join me today. Thank you for sharing so openly. I feel certain that we'll have people who come away from this feeling encouraged and feeling less isolated, that there's another person who has had some kind of similar journey and made it through and is thriving, because it can feel so terrifying when we're in the midst of the transition and we think, how will we ever feel normal or whole or safe or whatever it is again? And you are evidence that, yes, Don't give up. You'll get there.
There's one thing worse than going through all that transition that we were talking about, is to go through it and thinking you are alone. And my hope is this conversation and your work, Janice, can help undo some of the sense of aloneness that people feel in their journey towards searching for their authentic self.
Oh, thank you so much. And that really is one reason why I started the conference on religious trauma, because I wanted to have a place. My YouTube channel serves this way. People can come to that conference on religious trauma YouTube channel and find sessions from previous conferences on religious trauma, and they'll find podcast episodes where they're hearing other people talk about their own experiences and the hope that they feel today and the life that they have today. And we don't have to be bound and defined by the traumas that we have lived through. They do help to shape us, but we continue growing and continue moving forward in our life.
Yeah. Goes back to the river. River is continually flowing, and that's a good thing.
It really is. Thank you so much, Dr. Lam. And you are going to be speaking at the Conference on Religious Trauma online in October. And tickets for that are on sale right now at religionstraumaconference.org. And I want to thank everyone for tuning in today. I'm really glad you joined us. And thanks again, Ling.
Thank you, Janice.
Bye, everyone.